environment, social exclusion meant death. This legacy wiring lives on in modern brain systems, especially through the interplay between the limbic system, the prefrontal cortex, and neuromodulators like oxytocin, serotonin, and dopamine. But when this system becomes overactive or misdirected, as it often does in the case of chronic people pleasing, it creates a pattern of behavior that feels rewarding in the moment but undermines long-term well-being, performance, and self-respect. When someone is compulsively nice, their nervous system is typically operating under a subtle but persistent threat response. This threat isn't tied to physical danger, but to social rejection. The amygdala, a part of the brain involved in threat detection, lights up in anticipation of conflict or disapproval, sending signals that trigger stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. The body then responds as if it's under attack, even when there is no immediate danger. This biological loop creates a powerful internal drive to avoid discomfort by appeasing others, saying yes when you mean no, or staying silent to avoid confrontation. Over time, this repeated behavior becomes encoded in the neural circuitry as a conditioned response, one that overrides rational evaluation of what is actually best for you. Oxytocin plays a key role in reinforcing this niceness loop. It's commonly labeled as the love hormone or the trust molecule, but its true function is more nuanced. Oxytocin increases social bonding and in-group favoritism, which can be healthy in contexts where genuine connection exists. However, in people-pleasing behavior, oxytocin becomes a reward for submission. When you behave in a way that pleases others even at the expense of your own needs, your brain releases oxytocin, giving you a temporary feeling of relief or connection. But this connection is conditional, often based on performance or compliance. You're not connecting from a place of truth, you're connecting from a place of survival. That distinction matters because it shapes the long-term wiring of your brain and the integrity of your identity. What often goes unnoticed is how this niceness strategy rewires your reward system. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with motivation, drive, and reinforcement of behavior, becomes tied to external validation rather than internal goals. Each time you are rewarded with approval for being agreeable, your brain logs that experience as good. Over time, your decision-making processes are shaped less by what you want or believe and more by what will keep others happy with you. This is a distortion of the dopaminergic system. Your motivation is no longer self-directed, but hijacked by external feedback. You become a reactive organism, not a responsive human being. This is a major cost to your autonomy. Moreover, this behavior pattern decreases activity in the parts of the brain responsible for executive control and increases reliance on lower-order emotional processing centers. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for long-term planning, boundary setting, and value-based decision-making, becomes subordinate to the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula, which are more reactive and focused on error detection and social pain. This internal neurological imbalance contributes to anxiety, indecision, and an inability to assert oneself even in situations where it is clearly necessary. It's also important to understand the metabolic toll this behavior takes. Chronic people-pleasing is not a passive act, it is physiologically expensive. Every time you suppress your true opinion, every time you override your discomfort to maintain peace, your body uses stress hormones to keep you in a controlled state. These hormones don't simply vanish after the interaction. They linger, alter your sleep patterns, impair digestion, and over time can dysregulate your immune system. Your body starts to internalize stress not just as an emotion, but as a baseline physiological state. This contributes to long-term health issues and accelerates burnout, both mentally and physically. This need to be nice to everyone also erodes your capacity for authentic connection. When you operate from a place of constant appeasement, others cannot trust the signals you give off. You may be liked, but you're not respected. You might be accepted, But you're not truly known, and your brain knows this. At a subconscious level, your insular cortex, the part of the brain that monitors internal state and emotional truth, senses the incongruence between how you feel and how you act. That incongruence generates a feedback loop of unease, of not being quite right in your own skin. Over time, this can lead to symptoms of depression, low self-worth, and even identity confusion. You no longer trust your own signals because you've spent so long overriding them for others. Breaking out of this pattern begins with awareness. You need to identify that the impulse to be nice is often not a moral decision, but a fear-based reflex. It is driven by conditioned circuits in your brain that equate rejection with danger and validation with safety. But those circuits can be retrained. Neuroplasticity is real and always available. The moment you begin to interrupt the niceness response, even just by pausing, by noticing the physiological signals in your body, you start to disrupt the automaticity of the behavior. That disruption is what opens the door to real change. The path forward is not about becoming unkind. It's about developing the ability to tolerate the discomfort of being real. Because when you do that, your niceness transforms from something compulsive into something deliberate. And that's where your true power lies, not in being agreeable, but in being aligned with what is biologically and psychologically true for you. When you make it a habit to please others at the expense of your own needs, you're not just making a psychological sacrifice, you're subjecting your entire nervous system to a pattern of chronic activation that damages your physical and mental health over time. Chronic people-pleasing is a stress response. It may not come with the intensity of a panic attack or the obvious signs of emotional breakdown, but it operates through the same biological systems that respond to threat and survival. The body doesn't differentiate between a physical threat and a perceived social one when it comes to stress. If you constantly behave in ways to avoid disapproval, conflict, or discomfort, your system registers this as a persistent threat, keeping you in a low-grade fight-or-flight state. The hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal HPA axis, the central stress response system, becomes overstimulated in this context. Each time you override your boundaries or say yes when you mean no, cortisol is released. Cortisol is not inherently bad. It helps you wake up in the morning, maintain alertness, and respond to acute stress. But when it's released constantly due to micro stresses like avoiding confrontation or suppressing emotion, it starts to have downstream effects on your health. It disrupts your circadian rhythm, affects your immune response, and begins to break down tissues in the brain and body. This is the biology of burnout. You're not tired because you're doing too much. You're tired because you're betraying your internal signals repeatedly, and your body is compensating for it. This behavior pattern also impairs your dopamine system. Dopamine, which drives motivation, focus, and pleasure from goal-directed behavior, becomes dysregulated when it's used to chase approval rather than authentic achievement. Over time, you become less motivated by your own internal standards and more driven by external cues, whether people are happy with you, whether you've avoided disappointment, whether everyone is comfortable. The result is a loss of personal direction. You begin to feel aimless, unmotivated, and disconnected from any sense of internal drive. This leads to a dangerous neurological shift. Instead of working toward goals that reflect your values, you begin working toward keeping things calm, avoiding tension, and being seen as agreeable. That's not motivation, that's survival. People-pleasing also suppresses emotional clarity. Your brain is constantly assessing internal and external information to determine what's safe and what's not, what you want and what you don't. This process is supported by the insula, a region of the brain that monitors interoception, the perception of bodily states. When you continually override your feelings, you blunt the signal to noise ratio in this system. You lose the ability to distinguish between I'm uncomfortable because I'm growing and I'm uncomfortable because I'm compromising. That's not a mental block, it's a physiological deficit created by repetition. And the more you repeat it, the more your body loses its ability to give you accurate feedback. You become emotionally numbed. You can't make good decisions when your internal compass is offline. In social dynamics, people who suppress their needs are often seen as safe, flexible, or easygoing. But inside, their bodies are under tension. The vagus nerve, which is responsible for parasympathetic regulation, helping you rest, digest, and stay emotionally calm, functions best when you are in a state of congruence. Congruence means your actions align with your internal truth. When you speak and act in ways that betray your own feelings, the vagus nerve becomes less efficient at regulating your stress response. This creates symptoms like shallow breathing, tightness in the chest, digestion issues, and frequent fatigue. These are not random health complaints, they are direct consequences of living in a chronic state of misalignment. There's also a feedback loop between unexpressed emotion and internal inflammation. When emotional energy isn't metabolized through expression or movement, it becomes stored in the body as a kind of low-level threat signal. The immune system, constantly picking up on subtle cues from the nervous system, begins to react. Cytokines signaling proteins involved in immune response become elevated in people with chronic stress. This leads to systemic inflammation, which has been linked to depression, anxiety, and a wide range of chronic illnesses. It is not an exaggeration to say that habitual people pleasing is not just a psychological risk but a physiological one. You are literally making yourself sick by living in opposition to what your nervous system is trying to tell you. When you avoid conflict repeatedly, you also shrink your stress tolerance. The stress response system is plastic. It adapts based on exposure. If you never allow yourself to face interpersonal discomfort, your body starts to perceive any kind of disagreement or pushback as a major threat. Your heart rate rises disproportionately, your voice shakes. You may even freeze. This is not because you're inherently anxious, it's because you've never conditioned your system to tolerate the energy of healthy disagreement. And the less you tolerate it, the more you avoid it. This becomes a self-reinforcing cycle where avoidance leads to sensitivity, which leads to more avoidance, and so on. Eventually, even minor interactions feel exhausting because your system is so finely tuned to anticipate threat from human interaction. This behavior also erodes your sense of self. Identity is built through boundaries. When you say, "This is what I value," or "This is where I stand," you're reinforcing a neural map of who you are. But when you say yes to everything and everyone, you blur those internal lines. You become more reactive, less grounded, and more vulnerable to manipulation. This creates not only confusion internally, but also unpredictability for others. People can't trust a person who doesn't show who they really are. They might like you, but they can't rely on you. That lack of trust, not loud conflict, is what ultimately damages relationships. Chronic people pleasing is not a harmless personality trait. It is a maladaptive coping mechanism with serious consequences. It hijacks your stress system, reshapes your reward circuits, numbs your emotional clarity, weakens your immune function, and diminishes your sense of self. It's not rooted in kindness, it's rooted in fear. And the body, over time, will reflect that fear in the form of fatigue, illness, resentment, and disconnection. When you trade truth for comfort, you create a silent war inside yourself, one your biology is forced to fight every day. Boundaries are not just about personal preference or social etiquette. They are deeply tied to your biological and neurological health. The capacity to establish and maintain boundaries is a reflection of how well your nervous system can differentiate between what is safe and what is threatening, what is aligned and what is not. It's not about being rude or aggressive. It's about maintaining internal coherence. When you fail to set boundaries, your brain and body interpret that failure as a form of threat exposure. Every time you agree to something that feels wrong, every time you allow yourself to be mistreated, or even just go along with something to avoid discomfort, your nervous system takes a hit. Over time, this cumulative lack of protection from misalignment erodes your psychological stability and physiological resilience. Boundaries activate core regions of the prefrontal cortex, particularly those associated with executive function, decision making, and moral reasoning. When you say no to something that's misaligned, even if it creates short-term tension, you reinforce circuits in the brain responsible for agency and long-term regulation. This is neurobiological empowerment. You are training your system to value coherence over compliance. Each time you assert a boundary, especially when it's difficult, the anterior cingulate cortex, which detects error and monitors conflict, becomes more adept at tolerating discomfort without defaulting to appeasement. Over time, this creates a stronger, more stable internal state where stress becomes manageable and your emotional system becomes more resilient. On a physiological level, boundaries are also essential for maintaining autonomic balance. The autonomic nervous system, which controls involuntary functions like heart rate, digestion, and hormone release, has two main branches, the sympathetic fight or flight and the parasympathetic rest and digest. When you're unable to set boundaries, your system often defaults into sympathetic overdrive, constantly bracing, managing, and anticipating others' reactions. This sympathetic dominance wears the body down, impairing recovery, disrupting sleep, and depleting resources over time. In contrast, healthy boundaries signal safety. They tell your body, I can trust myself to act in alignment with my values. That internal trust enhances parasympathetic tone, increasing heart rate variability and reducing stress hormones, key markers of a regulated, resilient system. Boundary setting also shapes your neurochemical landscape. Dopamine and serotonin, which regulate mood, motivation, and satisfaction, become more balanced when your behavior aligns with your values. Dopamine is not just a pleasure molecule, it's a signaling mechanism that rewards behavior that moves you closer to a perceived goal. When you set boundaries and follow through on them, even in the face of discomfort, your brain registers that as a meaningful achievement. That positive reinforcement builds a loop of self-trust and integrity. On the other hand, if you consistently override your own limits to accommodate others, you break that loop. Over time, you may experience a drop in baseline dopamine, leading to apathy, lack of drive, and emotional flatness. This isn't about willpower or personality, it's neurochemical feedback. The vagus nerve, one of the most critical components of the nervous system for emotional and physiological regulation, is also highly responsive to boundary dynamics. When you assert yourself with clarity and calm, your vagus nerve supports emotional processing, empathy, and social engagement. It allows you to stay connected without abandoning yourself. But if you suppress your truth to maintain harmony, the vagus nerve can become dysregulated. This results in either shut down dorsal vagal dominance, which creates numbness and fatigue, or overengagement ventral, sympathetic override, which creates anxiety and hypervigilance. The state of your boundaries is literally mapped into your body through your nervous system's functioning. What often gets overlooked is that boundaries are not just about others, they are about how you relate to yourself. When you say yes to things you don't want to do, you teach your brain that your needs don't matter. You suppress internal signals in favor of external cues. This trains your nervous system to deprioritize your own state in the presence of others. Over time, this leads to dissociation, emotional confusion, and reduced sensitivity to your own feelings. You can no longer tell what you actually want. You might feel fine on the surface, but internally you're disoriented. That confusion is not random. It is the predictable result of repeated self-abandonment. Conversely, the act of boundary setting enhances interoceptive accuracy, your ability to sense what's happening in your own body. The more you listen to your discomfort and act on it, the sharper your internal signals become. You begin to detect the difference between anxiety and intuition, between fatigue and avoidance. You stop guessing about your needs and start sensing them directly. This clarity is essential not just for mental health, but for effective decision-making and meaningful relationships. People who set boundaries are not just protecting themselves, they are creating the conditions for deep, honest, regulated connection. This capacity to uphold boundaries also strengthens neural circuits associated with habit formation. The brain thrives on consistency and pattern recognition. When you repeatedly choose alignment over avoidance, your default behavior shifts. What once felt terrifying, saying no, disappointing someone, holding your ground, becomes integrated. The brain adapts. What was once perceived as danger is now categorized as normal. That shift in neural coding is powerful. It means you are no longer beholden to fear-based reflexes. You begin to operate from intentionality rather than reactivity. That's not just psychological growth, that's neuroplasticity in action. Another key point is that boundaries, when practiced correctly, are not rigid walls, they are intelligent filters. They allow in what nourishes and protect against what depletes. This selective permeability is essential for nervous system health. When you don't have boundaries, your system becomes flooded with input, opinions, expectations, criticisms, and your brain has no clear filter to determine what belongs and what doesn't. That cognitive overload increases anxiety, impairs memory, and fragments attention. With clear boundaries, the brain has fewer inputs to manage, which enhances clarity, focus, and performance. You're no longer spinning in confusion, you know what matters, and your behavior reflects it. Boundaries are not something you set once and forget. They are living systems that require ongoing tuning. The nervous system is constantly adapting to your internal state and external environment. What was once a necessary boundary may need to shift. What you tolerated last year may be misaligned today. The brain doesn't resist this evolution, it welcomes it, as long as you stay attuned. Each time you act in alignment with your updated internal signals, you reinforce that you are safe in your own authority. That is the foundation of nervous system health, not avoidance, not appeasement, but regulated clarity through aligned action. Respect is not given freely, nor should it be. It is earned through the consistent expression of inner truth, through aligned behavior, and through the ability to hold presence under pressure. When you're constantly nice to everyone, overly agreeable, overly accommodating, always prioritizing comfort, you might be liked, but you are very rarely respected. The distinction between being liked and being respected is critical not just from a psychological standpoint, but from a neurobiological one. Your brain, particularly the social circuits rooted in the prefrontal cortex and limbic system, are deeply tuned to assess social rank, status, and credibility. We evolved to detect strength, not necessarily physical strength, but coherence, authority, and clarity of self. When you hide your opinions, suppress your needs, and soften your tone just to keep the peace, your system broadcasts confusion rather than confidence. Other nervous systems pick up on that instantly, often unconsciously. Respect is a neurobiological transaction, and the currency is congruence. When you lack congruence when what you feel, say, and do are not in alignment, the nervous systems of others perceive it as instability. The medial prefrontal cortex and the temporoparietal junction in others' brains are constantly assessing the trustworthiness and predictability of your behavior. If you're overly nice in a way that doesn't match the situation or feels excessive, the other person's brain interprets that as a mismatch. This mismatch generates a kind of subtle cognitive dissonance. They may not consciously know why, but they'll begin to feel uneasy or skeptical around you. Not because you've done anything overtly wrong, but because your internal signals don't align with your external behavior. That lack of alignment breeds distrust, even if it's dressed up as kindness. This is especially true in leadership, relationships, and high-stakes environments. People don't respect others who crumble under pressure or who abandon themselves to keep others comfortable. The prefrontal cortex is highly attuned to strength of character. When someone communicates clearly, even if it's uncomfortable, it generates a sense of security. That security is rooted in neurochemistry. Oxytocin and vasopressin, neuropeptides involved in trust and bonding, are more likely to be released when another person demonstrates consistency and firmness, not when they're trying to be liked. A person who speaks their truth calmly and clearly, who doesn't fold under tension, triggers safety signals in others. That's when real respect is formed. It's not loud or aggressive. It's stable, clear, and embodied. Being too nice can also signal to others that you don't trust your own judgment. From a neurobiological lens, confidence is communicated not only through words, but through microexpressions, tone, body posture, and emotional energy. When you constantly defer to others, soften your opinions, or avoid standing firm, you communicate even subtly that you don't value your own insight. Other people's nervous systems pick up on that, and they begin to mirror it. Mirror neurons, especially active in the premotor cortex, play a major role in how people empathize and align socially. If you consistently present yourself as small, uncertain, or overly deferential, others will begin to unconsciously perceive you that way. You're training them to undervalue you by how you show up. That's not a personality flaw, that's neurobiology in motion. Respect is also grounded in boundaries. When you're nice to everyone all the time, you don't just confuse your own internal signals, you dilute your external ones. People cannot respect someone whose boundaries are constantly moving or non-existent. From a systems perspective, the brain thrives on pattern recognition. Predictable behavior is interpreted as safe and trustworthy. If you're always shifting to please, adapting to accommodate, or hiding your real stance, your pattern becomes unpredictable. That inconsistency sends micro-stress signals to others' brains. They may not consciously recognize it, but they'll begin to treat you with less seriousness. You'll be included, but not consulted. You'll be heard, but not listened to. You'll be present, but not truly seen. That erosion of presence starts when you choose niceness over authenticity. Assertiveness, on the other hand, enhances social clarity. When someone speaks with grounded confidence, not arrogance, not hostility, but clarity, they create a neurological signature of strength. The amygdala in others' brains reduces its threat signal because it no longer has to second-guess your motives. The anterior cingulate cortex relaxes because it isn't monitoring you for incongruence. Your presence is felt as clean and honest. That's why the most respected people are often the ones who are direct. Not because they dominate, but because their system transmits a signal of internal order, and order, in the face of social complexity, is rare and highly valued. Another key point is that being overly nice erodes your influence. Influence is a neurobiological phenomenon rooted in coherence and status perception. People are influenced by those they respect, not by those who seek approval. When you habitually defer, you signal lower status. And even if you intellectually reject hierarchies, your brain and body don't. Status isn't about superiority. It's about energetic clarity and self-leadership. If your presence doesn't carry weight because it's diluted by over-accommodation, then people will bypass you when it comes to decisions, collaboration, and trust. You become safe but dispensable. And that's a costly neurological position to live in. Being respected also has tangible effects on your own neurology. When your system senses that you're valued for your clarity, not just your compliance, it begins to regulate differently. Serotonin, in which governs mood, confidence, and social standing, increases when you feel seen and respected for who you are, not for how well you perform emotional labor. That serotonin An increase creates upward spirals of self-assurance, energy, and presence. It makes it easier to hold your ground, to express truth, to maintain boundaries, even when it's hard. In contrast, when respect is absent and you feel invisible or taken for granted, serotonin levels drop. That drop often shows up as irritability, sadness, low confidence, and withdrawal. These aren't signs of personality disorder, they're biological responses to relational incoherence. Respect is earned through the expression of self-authority, not through dominance, but through regulated presence, not through excessive kindness, but through grounded clarity. The people who command respect are the ones who speak when it matters, who hold tension without collapsing, and who are willing to be misunderstood rather than be misaligned. This is not about posturing or performing strength. It's about embodying coherence so deeply that your system becomes a signal of truth, and others, whether they know it or not, feel it and respond to it accordingly.